My name is Molly McGill, and welcome to the Art of Disney and Pixar. I'm so excited to have you guys here. So each week, we're going to learn a little bit more about how Disney got started, how animation progressed from like 1900 till today, and how Disney animators decide what they're going to make into a movie and those artistic processes. But to get started, what I want to go over today at first is just where animation comes from. Because animation is not a new concept. It actually starts a lot earlier than you might think. But just to give you a bit of an overview, we're going to go over a lot of different things in this class. We're going to talk about art, we're going to talk about different types of technology, we're going to talk about how animation relates to fine art or things you might see in a museum. We're going to learn a lot of different things. And that's because a lot of animation has art in it that you may not even realize is there. So for example, here in the top right, we see the Sphinx in Aladdin. We see Greek art being represented in Hercules. This one's one of my favorites. This painting that is in The Little Mermaid that she touches during Part of Your World, it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art here. We also see in Frozen all of these different references to Rococo painting. American Gothic pops up in Mulan. We have a lot of different art references in Disney movies that are very obvious. But we also have some that aren't so obvious. So we'll talk about how German painting really influenced how Snow White looked. We'll talk about pop art and Andy Warhol and how that influenced 101 Dalmatians. We'll talk about German Expressionism and how its creepy vibes really influenced parts of Fantasia. And we'll talk about how the people who were creating Sleeping Beauty were really influenced by Renaissance art coming out of Italy. So there's a lot to talk about, and so let's get started. First, what I want to do is actually show you a video of Walt Disney explaining where animation came from. And he's going to talk about cave paintings and hieroglyphics and all kinds of really cool stuff. And I figure if you can hear about it from him, why would you want to hear about it from me? So I'm going to show you about the first 8 minutes of this, and then we'll talk a little bit more about different ways people developed animation.
Walt Disney's Disneyland.
When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are.
Each week as you enter this timeless land, one of these many worlds will open to you. Frontierland. Tall tales and true from the legendary past. Tomorrowland. Promise of things to come. Adventureland. The wonder world of nature's own realm. Fantasyland. The happiest kingdom of them all. Presenting this week, the story of the animated drawing. Now your host, Walt Disney.
Most of us are inclined to think of the animated cartoon as a modern invention, like the airplane or the automobile. But actually, the idea of imparting life and motion to still pictures is as ancient as man himself. But in our time, we've seen this dream come true. The animated drawing has matured and has taken its rightful place among the fine arts. This picture is from our Nutcracker Suite, one of the musical numbers in our production, Fantasia. Art galleries all over the country exhibited many such setups from that production. People bought them as they would any other kind of painting. Yet consider this fact. This picture moved. It's true, it only represents one frame of a motion picture film. But Delicate and intricate though it is, it came to life. Now, to do this would have been only wishful thinking as short a time ago as the 1920s. And yet the groundwork for this accomplishment was laid long before that. Now, we in the profession know that we owe a debt of gratitude to our forerunners. And it is to these pioneers that we dedicate this program on the history of the animated drawing. Their story is part of what is contained in this book, The Art of Animation. Compiling this volume has been a pet project with us here at the studio. It took considerable time and careful research. Herein you can read about the artists who dreamed and experimented, had their failures and successes, but somehow never gave up trying to breathe life and movement into the inanimate picture. In effect, this is a history of our craft. It begins in prehistoric times with the artistic efforts of our first shaggy ancestors, the cavemen. Here's a reproduction of a wall painting found in the famous caves of Lascaux in France. Apparently, the caveman artist was trying to depict an animal in action the only way he knew how, by drawing it in a running position. At the same time, give or take a few thousand years, in a cave near Altamira in northern Spain, another artist was at work. Note the double pair of legs. Now, if he had been able to alternate these leg positions, as we can with our camera, he would have achieved the miracle of animation. Primitive, of course, like himself, but basically correct. Here we have an Egyptian wall decoration of about 2000 BC. This mural of two wrestlers has almost the appearance of a strip of film. If we again take certain liberties and skip from pose to pose, we here also achieve animation of sorts. Around the year 1500 AD, among the great men of the Italian Renaissance was Leonardo da Vinci, artist and inventor. Here is his diagram on which he just intended to show the proportions of the human figure. But our camera can make it animate. By emphasizing certain positions of the figure, it moves and dances.
Awesome. So what you see is art has been looking at how to animate things for so long. People have been trying to show motion in their artwork since pretty much people started creating art. But it's really not until the 1800s that we see this motion starting to happen in a bigger way, and mostly through toys, actually. And so I want to talk about a couple of toys that people create that demonstrate this. The first one is a thaumatrope, and it's a very basic toy. It's a little disc that sits on a string. And the idea is when you spin the string, the picture on the front and on the back of the disc will sort of fuse together in one image. And this is all based on a phenomenon that we call the persistence of vision. And that just says that if images are moving too fast, the human eye can't distinguish between those individual images. This is why when you have a flip book and you flip those pages super fast, those images appear to be moving all together because your eye can't see each individual image. We also see this in what's called a zoetrope. And a zoetrope becomes very popular in the 1860s because it becomes an amusement park attraction. It also relies on this persistence of vision, as most of these do. And basically, there are pictures inside this drum. And when you spin it, they appear to be moving like a flip book. So this flip book technology is really fascinating to people who've never seen anything like this before. And it's very similar to what we call a praxinoscope. And it, instead of having the images on the inside, had images along the outside that are then reflected in a mirror. And because of this, you could set up a praxinoscope right in front of a projector and project it on the screen almost like a little movie. This man named Emile Reynaud in 1877 did just that, and he called his stories the pantomime lumineuses. And what he did was projected these long strips of drawings and then paired them together with live music. And it was sort of the first time anyone saw animation in a theater. It wasn't quite a movie, but it was pretty close. Here is the difference between a praxinoscope and a zoetrope, just so you can tell. The praxinoscope uses mirrors and the zoetrope uses slits to peek into. So a little different, but they are very, very similar. And then we also have to talk about comic strips, because comic strips aren't popular until the late 1800s and into the 1900s. Originally, comic strips were only used to sort of make fun of people who were in charge in politics. And it's not until newspapers become really popular at the turn of the 20th century that we see comic strips becoming very popular. They build on sequential narrative storytelling like we just saw. So cave paintings, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, they sort of build on all of these things we've already seen. This is the very first comic strip ever released. It's Richard Felton Outcalt's The Yellow Kid from 1896. And you can see it sort of looks like a comic book. We have the story being told here, and then the words that he's saying are written on his yellow jacket. And without comic strips, animated film probably would not have been quite as popular. But it's not until we develop photography in a way that is a little more accessible that we can actually make movies. And we have to talk about the camera obscura, which is invented in the 11th century. And basically, it's this little box where if you poke a hole inside of it, an image can be reflected upside down to show you the image. And then a lot of animators use this, and a lot of artists use this, because they can have an image here that they can reflect into this box and then trace over here in the middle. So it's almost like a very early projector. But the camera obscura gets transformed in a way where then you can actually get the image inlaid on that paper. This doesn't look like a whole lot, but this is called a window from the view from the window at Le Gras. It's from 1826 or 27, we're not sure, but this is the earliest surviving photograph of a real world scene made using a camera obscura. And it doesn't look like a lot, but what we see is we see a rooftop and the top of some other buildings. And what Joseph Niepcefor Niepce did was put a camera obscura facing out of his apartment window. And using the proper chemicals, he allowed this image to develop. It took over 30 hours to develop this image, but it is the earliest surviving photograph. We also have this one here. This is from 1838, so about a decade after this one. And this is the earliest known photograph of a living person. For a long time, people did not photograph people because it was very, very hard. When it takes 8 to 10 to 12 to 15 hours to develop your photograph, it's hard to get people to sit still for that long. You can't just push a button and have a picture. So what we see is way down here. We see a man getting his shoes shined. And it just so happens that he stood there for long enough to become imprinted in this photograph. These streets would have been full of people through here, and cars and horse-drawn carriages. But they're all moving too fast to be seen by the camera. This guy happened to get his shoes shined for long enough that the camera saw him. This is what we call a daguerreotype process, and it's really, really complicated. It involves metal and chemicals and all sorts of crazy stuff that you can't even believe. We have to cut the metal and add the chemicals and sensitize it to the light and expose the image and then develop it and then fix it to the sheet and then gild it on and seal it. It's a whole process, not anything like what we see today. But it is with early photography that we see early animation starting to pop up. So what I want to do now is talk about a man named Edward Muybridge, who created the very first instance of animation. So I'd like to show you this video on Edward Muybridge and why he's important. It's from the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. It's very quick, and then I'll show you his animation that he actually created.
When Edward Muybridge began, photography was a relatively new medium. The pioneering photographers of his time had to essentially invent their own cameras and their own chemistry. Muybridge began his career making pictures of Yosemite, taking his bulky camera and portable darkroom through the valley's rough terrain to the high peaks where he could capture the landscape's dramatic heights and plunging chasms. To achieve the shots he wanted, he took his camera out to precipices where his assistants wouldn't dare follow. At this time, a controversy prevailed among experienced horsemen as to whether all the feet of a trotting horse were clear of the ground in the same instant. To settle the debate, the railroad magnate Leland Stanford hired Muybridge to photograph his prize racehorse, Occident, at a trot. Muybridge constructed a track specifically for the purpose. Multiple cameras were lined up, each connected to a wire stretched across the track. As the horse hit each wire, a camera was triggered to capture an instant in time. Horses on merry-go-rounds and an academic painting had long been represented with all feet off the ground, stretched out in front and back. Muybridge's pictures proved something else, that the feet do leave the ground at once, but when they're under the horse's body. These photos caused a great sensation. Meissonier, a celebrated painter of horses, is said to have wept when he saw Muybridge's photographs. It was the first time that such rapid motion could be seen like this, thin slices of time, quicker than anything the human eye could perceive. Muybridge experimented with the optical gadgets of the time, the zoetrope, thaumatrope, and phenakistoscope, and he created something he called the zoopraxiscope, a precursor to cinema. It showed his still images in rapid sequence, reanimating the still photos, and cast the image on a wall. Some would say that the only thing lacking was the sound of the hooves pounding the ground, or they would have believed that horses were really running through the room.
Here's what he created that showed these horses in action. And it is silent, you can't hear it, but look at how he manages to put these photographs together in a way to make it look like the horse is actually moving. This was really important at the time because no one had ever done anything like this. So in this lecture, we've gone over some of the precursors to animated film. So we've talked about cave paintings and Egyptian hieroglyphics and these parlor toys and how Edward Muybridge finally created something that could produce animation for the very first time. And in our next class, we'll talk about early animation and we'll talk about some of the ways animation developed over the beginning of the 20th century before we talk about Walt Disney. Thank you so much for being here and have a good day, everybody. Thank you.